name is Untitled Chapter. I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regime, which is one of the co-organizers of this conference. We are a bit waiting because the first chair of the conference is staying in the traffic and hopefully come soon, but sticking in the traffic jam. Sorry for that. I would like to introduce this conference and to welcome you. Thank you for coming. Our institute, many of you maybe do not know much about him. It's quite a new institute. It was founded about 10 years ago. The mission of the institute is about to research about the experience with unfreedom in the Czech society. It means the time of the war and the time of the communist dictatorship. Which is a bit funny for our conference today, that in the political document founding our institute, our research institute, is the time between 45 and 48 seen as a free time, as a democratic time. But despite that, since several years we are of course dealing this time also as a part of our research, because in this time after war, which is the issue of our conference, the new communist dictatorship was even born. You can hardly not see this time, this few years after war as a time of freedom, democracy, and so on, as the political consensus in the Czech Republic still is. I would like to thank the people who really, instead of me, organized this conference. Ota Konrad is the partner from the Faculty of Social Sciences of Charles University, and his colleagues. From my side is Jaromír Venka, who is taking in traffic jam, and Blanka Morova, she will also come very soon. And I'm also happy for the partners that they contributed to this conference. It's not only the Charles University, but also Project Retreat and the Heinrich University in Düsseldorf. We are thanking for it. And last but not least, let me welcome also Professor Norman Neimark, who came especially for this event from the US to us, to Prague. I'm really happy that he followed our invitation because he's of course one of distinct historians who can speak to this issue today evening. I hope we will all appreciate his speech and his keynote and the debate with that. Thank you for coming, and I wish you a good conference. And I would like to ask Ota to add my introducing commentaries.
Yeah, thank you. So, good morning again. I'm Ota Konrad. I'm the head of the Department for German and Austrian Studies at the Institute of International Studies, Faculty of Social Sciences, Charles University in Prague. So this university, a little bit difficult affiliation. However, I would like to, of course, to welcome in Prague. I would like to say something a little bit about our institute, Institute of International Studies, and then maybe a few words about our conference, because we have plenty of time waiting for the first chair. Our institute, Institute for International Studies, was established at the beginning of the 1990s. I think it was something like the answer to the demands for new experts about this new world rising after 1989. From the Czech perspective, in the 1990s, there were, I think, four important, crucial regions in the world. First, these immediate neighbors, Germany and Austria, then West European countries, and this time European Union, which the Czech Republic wanted to join. New ally, North America, United States, and of course this unstable region of Russia and East Europe. That's why we have today still at our institute four departments: my department for German and Austrian Studies, department for North American Studies, department for European Union, European Studies, and department for Russia and East European Studies. That means we are something like, I think, something like area studies. So we are a manifold collective of people, of mostly historians, in my case, of historians of the late 19th century, 20th century, and 21st century as well. But we have colleagues from the field of political science, from the field of culture history, literature history as well. So I want to thank my colleague from my department, Boris Barth, and from the Institute of the Study for Totalitarian Regimes, for very good cooperation during the organization of our conference. Also, I would like also thank to our long-term partner, the University of Düsseldorf, namely the Department for the History and Culture of Eastern Europe, led by Beate Fiesler. Welcome to Prague, Beate. And I would like also to thank our next supporter, the second supporter, which is Research Center at our university, Research Center Violence, Trauma and Justice. In this center we try to bring together people, colleagues from not only from the field of modern history, but political scientists and psychiatrists, psychologists, and colleagues from the faculty of law. That means very interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research hub, let's say, which was established 1 year ago. Maybe a few words about our conference, about the idea. I think I don't think I need to describe our conference in detail, because you have read, I think you have read the call for papers. Maybe only some little data, some few words about how it occurred to me, or it occurred to us to organize a conference about post-war violence in Europe, about post-war violence after 1945. In my case, I was and I'm still dealing with the violence in the First World War, in the home front, and in the immediate post-war period in the region of Central Europe. And if you compare, for example, the situation in Prague after 1918, after the end of the First World War, then with the situation in Prague, for example, in the Czech lands, after in May or in June 1945, May, June, July 1945 in Prague, then you will find a lot of differences. There are, of course, cases of violence against Germans and Jews in Prague in 1918-1919, but I think these cases mostly this case of the cases were not very brutal. It was mostly about some slaps and punches. On the contrary, after the Second World War, so in May and June, July 1945, in Prague and in the Czech lands, there was a lot of cases of very brutal violence. I think violence which could be described as a performative violence. That means the aim of this violence was not only to kill or eliminate the enemy, but to show this killing publicly, to produce this killing, this violence publicly, to make a one-man show. And for me it's a question why. Why this difference is between the First World War, the first post-war, the second post-war. And of course you can say, yeah, there was a brutal German occupation policy in the Czech lands and in Europe and Eastern Europe. There was brutal war. There was, of course, there were many cases of brutal German reprisals against partisans, against Czech civilians in the last days and weeks of the war. But still, I think the post-war violence is not only about revenge. It's not only about, let's say, it's not only an outburst of emotions and uncontrolled hysteria. The post-war violence, in my opinion, is at the same time, it's not only about the past, but it's at the same time about the future. So it's about, in my opinion, the reshaping the nation. It's about the recreating of the collective identities. It's about the reintegration of the post-war society. And that means, in my opinion, the post-war violence, physical violence, is not only a destructive force, but it's a constructive force as well. And this was, for me, the leading idea of this conference. So the question, how the specific post-war framework influenced the forms and intensity of the post-war violence. And that's something I would like to learn more about. And that's why we organized this conference. We wrote a call for paper with Boris and with Jaromír Brnka, with Blanka Murala, and we prepared this conference. We got a lot of abstracts. We choose, I think, the best papers. So welcome to Prague again. And yeah, and I'm really looking, it's not only an empty cliche, I'm really looking forward to the papers and for especially to the discussion. That's why we try to make plenty of time for discussion. We have, I think, more than 40-45 minutes in each panel for the discussion. So it's about this idea of the conference, or the history of these ideas of the conference. So before we start something pretty different, before we start an organizational remark, we will have to, as you know from our program, we will have 2 coffee breaks today and 1 coffee break tomorrow, which will take place in the neighboring room. All participants of the conference are invited to these breaks. We will also have lunch breaks today and tomorrow. However, due to the limited budget of the conference, we can only invite the active participants to the conference to the lunch. So that means speakers and chairs. The same goes for today's dinner, which will take place after the keynote of Mr. Neumann. So much for the introduction. The first panel deals with the justice. The panel should be chaired by Jaromír Brnka. I would like to, if you, Boris, could you help us and to start instead of Jaromír Brnka to the first chapter. Thank you.
I have to apologize for 2 things. I'm not on Boris part. Here, it's the first step. The second is, I'm very sorry about the weather. Normally, Prague in mid-May is a beautiful town, and if you look outside, it's again, sorry for that. But it has one thing which is positive, that it makes it more difficult to escape from the conference. I'm not really prepared for that panel, but it seems to be gender balanced. One last sentence, time management. All presentations or papers should be not longer than 20 minutes. 20 minutes means 20 minutes. It does not mean 22 minutes, it does not mean 23 minutes, and it does not mean 24 minutes. Okay? Except I will be extremely strict. So, the first paper is first presentation is Paula Duduma. She's a PhD student in history, culture, and global politics at the University of Bologna, Italy. She's a joint PhD university with Paris at the Sorbonne. And the title of her thesis is Women's Enemy. It strives for collaboration in the post-war period in comparison between Italy and France. And in July 2017, she's obtained her master's degree at the University of Turin. Future.
Good morning. Yes, my name is Barbara Delu, and she is Dr. Fidel. We are both PhD students. We'd like to thank the United Collaborators for this conference. We are trying to share with you today some of the findings we presented at a conference we have organized in February at the Bologna University, looking at post-war justice and the perspective between Italy and France. Chris and I are both of our PhDs on comparative studies, and the comparisons is useful to us both for similarities and differences of the two countries for better highlight the specificity of each single national case study. Many interesting reasons out of the context within our researchers emerged from the lecture, and the interesting in this context when they focus on the collective identities across Europe. And we therefore decided to continue the work by proposing here a joint intervention on the issue of social justice and its relation with the foundation of destruction of values in the aftermath of the Italian crisis. And we to do a introduction.
As some authors have highlighted, justice in its different forms can assume an important role to define collective identities and founding needs. We can think about, for example, the trial and the execution of Louis XVI for France, or of the importance in the sense of juridical documents such as the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution for the US, but also in a period closer to us, justice and in particular criminal proceedings have played an essential part in a period of transition. So as far as we are concerned, within the European countries emerged from the Second World War, justice became a powerful instrument for the affirmation of victory and an important tool to channel the desire of revenge of the population exhausted by the warriors. So the punishment of the occupiers and their collaborators through specially designed courts and juridical practice became a means by which the societies tried to rebuild and redefine their national identity according to new principles in opposition to those of previous regimes. In this sense, justice can be seen as a medium for the reshaping of certain post-war society. So we can say that justice has been a fundamental actor in the aftermath process of reconstruction both in France and Italy. And not only criminal law has been used to punish the actor of violence perpetrating during the war, but also it has been used in order to teach one particular and specific interpretation of history. In this sense, the goal of post-war trials were therefore not only to close the books with the past regimes, but also to lay the foundation for a rebirth of the nation and for a redefinition of its values, strongly undetermined from the violence of the conflict. So criminal proceedings became a public show with pedagogical purpose, a theater of ideas where shaping collective memory and national identities. Moreover, if you take into account the difficult passage from territorial regimes or collaborative government to democracy and rule of law, justice still remains a crucial domain. Indeed, through judgments, amnesty, and so on, a society marks the dividing line between who can be part of the new society and its own right, and who should be excluded. In Italy and France, the trials against collaborators had the aim of guiding the population towards a new democratic phase through the exclusion of those who had been compromised with the regimes and the occupiers. So the punishment of the collaborators was turned toward the past as directed against those who had favored an enemy, but at the same time looked to the future in an attempt to elaborate a shared memory on the past conflict, to give shape to renewed common values and to prevent further authoritarian drifts. Though the creation of extraordinary courts, new juridical norms and new penalties, Italy and France tried to heal the deep social splits and to lay the foundation for a future internal cohesion around an identity recognized by all. Besides great trials against the most important exponents of the regimes and against the main perpetrators of war crime, the purge also had a popular character strongly marked by a proximity dimension. Neighborhood relations, village relations, work, even family relationships suffered the effects of the war and were marked by purification processes. This popular dimension strongly influenced the process of redefining the values and the national identity. And French and Italians were not mere spectators, but became protagonists of the change and givers of profound social changes. Before getting to the art of the matter, one last thing should be added. Until now, I have spoken about extraordinary justice. Nevertheless, we have to remind that also ordinary justice starts again to exercise its role in the different countries. And this is extremely important to understand what we are going to say now, because our two researches are Barbara is working on the trials on the women who had collaborated in Italy and France, and I am working for my PhD on the trials against partisans. So two sides of, you can see, yes, two sides of the same coin.
Okay, as we said, in Italy and France, post-war justice is the form of pedagogic theater, within which the punishment of the enemy had above all the objective of redefining the values and identity of the nation. And my research analyzed how in this context the condemnation of fascist women was perceived as a sort of purification rite, aimed at normalizing the main customs by bringing back them to the ambit of respectability. In fact, in the chaos of wars, women had to face the lack of men and supply the innumerable difficulties generated by the violence of a conflict that largely involved the civilian population. They were therefore forced to abandon the traditional roles and leave the dimension exclusively domestic of wife and mother to face up to the basic needs of everyday life. Furthermore, the women took an active part in the conflict, and many of them chose the side of the enemy. Some accusations against women, such as those of denunciation, arrest, torture, murders, and raid, demonstrate the effective participation of some women in the regime and the action of violence carried out by mass military forces. Especially in Italy, many women were prosecuted for carrying weapons and for wearing the uniform, which until then had been exclusively a male domain, subverting gender roles and forcing the entire society to rethink gender boundaries and different sexual identities according to new criteria. In this context, the trial against women were aimed at normalizing female customs, re-establishing the division between genders undermined by the war. For this reason, the imputation and the punishment for women were also part of an attempt to restore a perceived moral order, and accusation and defense clashed over the ambit of respectability and good morals even before the crime that they had committed. The sexuality of the accused became central to the discourse about abuse, and the suspicion of horizontal collaboration through sexual or sentimental with the enemy was directed exclusively toward women and was considered an emblematic form of female collaboration. Having had love affairs, sexual friendship relation with the enemy was considered a betrayal of men, of public morals and of the nation, and punishment mixed morals, nationalism and personalism. Therefore, it is clear that during the months of liberation, hair shaving became one of the main instruments for reconstructing the nation for the good and the main form of summary justice against women. In this case, the female body, punished and exposed as a warning, was used to symbolize the process of purification, to reassert its masculinity, and restore the traditional relationship between genders. The women's body became a further combat domina between the two sides, where political, ideological, and gender conflicts found a symbol of discrimination and a channel of representation. Between 1943 and 1946, in particular in the days of liberation, 20,000 women were shaved in France, and 60% of these for the simple fact of having a relation with the occupiers. The public shaving almost exclusively affected the female sex and can therefore be considered a sexual purge. Hair cutting was a symbolic attack on femininity because was considered both a weakness for women and a stretch of femininity because of its power to drive desire. So the shaving was not only the punishment for a sexual collaboration, but also, and perhaps above all, a sexual punishment for female collaboration, which literally brought on stage the body of the condemned by linking betrayal with sexuality. Finally, the post-war courts also elaborated a particular gender justice, separated from that of men and characterized by its own dynamic and rhetoric. In fact, female collaborationism was the subject of a specific discourse aimed at reinforcing the rules that regulated the role in the social life of women. The cults swung between two opposite poles. Both suffered from misogynist, Judean tradition and facilities of cliché and stereotypes widely shared by society. In fact, a first attitude tended to consider women as weak and fickle subjects, incapable of committing criminal acts, and easily influenced and misled by love according to the ancient conception of the femita sexus and the irrational and irresponsible feminine character. The judgment against women was therefore largely influenced by this stereotype, and in many cases the sentences were more lenient than if the defendants for the same crime had been men. On the contrary, however, when women diverged strictly from the traditional idea of femita sexus, the judgment would be decidedly more severe, and female behavior was judged as a result of perversion, wickedness, lack of inhibition, and bestiality. Because judgment in this case revolved around the idea of betrayal of immunity and severely punished those behaviors and impulse given to deny and disavow the characteristics that were considered proper to the female gender. Stereotypes of this nature were used by the defendants themselves and their lawyers to build effective defensive strategies. In the juridical discourse of lawyers, women were often described as eternal victims, and the collaborators presented themselves as weak, insignificant, with little intelligence and at the mercy of the events. This same rhetoric was recurrent in the instance of pardon, which are a precious source for reconstructing a political and cultural climate which, especially in Italy, in a few years changed profoundly, leading to a substantial collective amnesia on the crime of Versailles and release in a short time of all the collaborators. Already during the trials, those who had collaborated with the regime and the Germans showed no sign of repentance, nor did they question their choice, representing themselves as oppressed and unjustly punished by the leaders. From the end of the 1940s, in the numerous requests for pardon and initial release, the collaborators began to present themselves no longer as war criminals, but as unjustly held political prisoners, and the pardon was transformed from a concession to a due act to restore a justice violated during the post-war period. In the case of women of Italian Social Republic, moreover, this reversal of perspective was joined by the request of the defendants and their family to return the incarcerated women to their loved one and to their roles as wives and mothers, considered of fundamental importance for the integrity of the family and the obligation of child rearing. This is the case, for example, of Adriana Paoli, a fugitive, Italian fugitive condemned for collaboration and multiple voluntary homicide, who obtained conditional release on 1st of October 1955 because mother of 2 children. And the former fascist of Salo, having taken uniform and thrown down her weapons, had simply become La Signora Paoli, a lady who needed help in the name of humanitarian reasons. In conclusion, these stereotypes, be they benevolent and paternalistic or severe and dehumanizing, had the effect to deny the political motivation of women's decision to collaborate with the enemy. By insisting on the affective dimension of their choice in their domestic roles, or on the other side, by expelling the collaborators from belonging to the female gender, the post-war judge brought the image of women in arms, or the more destabilizing who were siding with the enemy, back to an unusual and temporary phenomenon, due exclusively to the barbarization of the population during the war. I finish here, I know that today.
And as we said, we consider the trials against collaborators and partisans as two sides of the same coin. So I want now to propose you to take into account the binomial justice and partisans. And after the liberation both of France and Italy, partisans need to face new challenges and to find their position within the picture. And the fact that the figure of the partisan becomes immediately the center of political debates prove how the memory of the clandestine fight, consisting in a turning point of strategic relevance for all the parties relying on the resistance. Once the war is over, what characterizes the figure of the partisan are two opposite concepts, the research for recognizing legitimacy and the celebration of their figure on the one side, and the link with the violence on the other. Therefore, it's useful to highlight the existing dualism that make the partisan figure and the resistance swing between a celebratory rhetoric and a challenge of their legitimacy. So once the fight against the Nazi fascism is won, a return to order is urgently envisaged by the new states, and consequently resistance and the resistant fighters should be normalized. Even if much less studies in comparison to collaborators' trials has been done, it is not surprising that in a context of restored legality, some acts perpetrated by partisans during the liberation fight have been brought to justice in the aftermath of the war, and these partisans were prosecuted after the liberation, and so after the end of the war, for acts connected to the liberation fight, connected to the resistance movement. And so actually after the end of the war, both in France and Italy, obviously with some differences and similarities, some partisans were legally prosecuted for acts related to resistance, but perceived as criminal acts by law. So before getting to the art of the matter, I estimate that to achieve a better understanding of this phenomenon, it is required to describe it also from a quantitative point of view, and I will be very fast in that. Concerning the Italian case, some researches allow to enucleate 3 different periods, chronologically consecutive. First, the legal proceedings were brought by the Allied administration. And we are at the end of 45. During this short period, so right in the days after the liberation, military justice pronounced severe punishment against partisans. The second period, from 46 to the beginning of 48, the trials are few. And finally, the third period starting in 48, after the Communist Party left the government in 47. So the start of a great campaign of penal repression. The number of trials in this period is really elevated, so elevated that some contemporaries spoke about anti-partisan offenses, repression, persecution. Just a few numbers. A committee that estimate that 20,000 trials against partisans were done start in 48 to the middle of the 50s. Concerning France, they spoke about 10,000 partisans involved in judicial proceedings. So it is impossible to enter in detail, but we want to highlight that the trial of partisans, most of them communists, became immediately a challenge for political parties, and here is a sentence of a death sentence for a partisan. And in fact, these trials deal both with the difficulties in dealing with the internal conflict, the shaping of values, on which the free state should rely, as well as the construction of resistant memories. Concerning the Italian case, the trial seems to assume an offensive character, which seems to become part of the largest framework of questionings of the resistance movement. This trial seems to call into question the legitimacy of the resistance in itself. There is a switch between the single, the individual, which is prosecuted, and the entire movement. As in a synecdoche, the trial of partisans became the trial of the resistance. So the governmental parties wanting to present themselves as having taken part in the resistance, but at the same time they wanting to be stranger to violence committed during the war. So they want to find the newly born republic on the patriotic resistance, but it is a resistance without violence. For example, some French press spoke about resistance without partisans, résistance sans résistants. where the specificity and the concreteness of the fight get lost in favor of a more generical concept in which different positions can identify. I think that we can find an explanation of this fact in the idea that if we consider the French case, the French people were not only resisted, so everybody had the idea that everybody had been partisan isn't true. If we consider the trials of partisans, we can clearly see that they are persecuted because they are partisans. In other words, the fact of having been partisan is the criteria. So they are called into question because they were and they are minoritarian. So through justice, we can grasp the society look upon partisan. So in this trial, maybe in a subtle or in a latent way, maybe in an unconscious way, there is the idea that it should be better to mistrust people who have broken the law. Even if it were fascist law or vicious laws, partisans have done it during the war, during the resistance fight, and they did it for the good reason, but now in peacetime, the risk is that they continue to break the law. And this option is not tolerable for the new state. Therefore, we can affirm that in this kind of trials, we can find the look upon people who have been illegals. Once the war is over and the peace comes again, have been an illegal is not forcing a good thing. It's not forcing a glorious thing. And I just want to conclude with this picture. They are from the two journals, French journals, communist and partisan journals. And Barbara spoke about race, and it's extremely interesting if we consider race as a symptom of a changing political climate. So together with race, there are amnesty laws in Italy in 46, in France later in 51, 53. But in both cases, when there is the debate on amnesty laws, we can see that on the press, in the public sphere, the collaborators are in parallel with the partisan. Collaborators get out of prison, as you can see in the titles, and partisans get in prison. So there is this two, the double standard of justice that is pointed by the press in the public sphere. So really, in conclusion, we have tried to show that the trial of partisans and the trials of women collaborators are part of that use of justice that we have tried to define at the beginning, and we have tried to materialize that concept with these two examples. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that paper. I think we'll have a general discussion after the presentations. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I didn't know that you were planning to cooperate so closely, and I didn't introduce you. So good afternoon. I'm happy with that now. There's a PhD student in History, Culture and Civilization at the University of Bologna. Her research interests are resistance, liberation, war, and the aftermath of World War II, both in France and Italy. And in November 2015, she obtained her master's degree in historical science at the University of Bologna and at the University of Paris 7 Diploma.
Thank you.
My fault. So, our next speaker. Is Annika Simon. She's a postdoctoral research fellow in legal history at the Max Planck Institute for Social Law and Social Policy in Munich. Her current research focuses on notions of inclusion and exclusion in Scandinavian social policy during the interwar period. In 2019, she graduated with a PhD in history from the University of Cambridge. And her dissertation concerned the trials of wartime collaborators in Norway between 1945 and 1957. I'm sure you will explain why you chose that period.
Yeah.
And she holds law degrees from King's College London, Humboldt University Berlin, and the University of Cambridge. And her research interests lie at the intersection of law, politics, and nationhood in Western Europe during the 20th century, with a particular focus on Scandinavian religion.
Thank you very much. So the title of my presentation is Mentalities of War, Mentalities of Peace, Capital Punishment in the Norwegian Treason Trials. And yeah, this is part of my doctoral thesis, which concerned the trials of wartime collaborators, and which I'm currently turning into a monograph for publication. My thesis focused on the justificatory narratives that authorities, politicians, and courts invoked in order to carry out these trials. The Norwegian authorities were intent on carrying out these trials in line with Norwegian legal principles and traditions, an aspect that they stressed both during and after the occupation. But the extraordinary circumstances of the time meant that pre-war legal principles seemed insufficient. For this reason, the Norwegian exile government, based in London, adopted a series of extraordinary legal measures, one of which was to reintroduce the death penalty into Norwegian criminal law. And today I want to zoom in on this question of the death penalty, and I will examine ideas of the national community and the national self-image in coastal Norway through the lens of public discourses on the death penalty. Now, a key element of this analysis will be what status collaborators should have after the liberation, and whether they needed to be eliminated or whether there were prospects for their reintegration into Norwegian society. Another element that I will focus on today is the compatibility of the death penalty with the nation's self-image following the liberation. And so what we'll run through this analysis is how these discourses, public discourses, drew upon the war experience on the one hand and the principles and values of the post-war nation on the other. And this is just a quick overview. I will proceed roughly chronologically, and I will start in the pre-war era. So when Germany invaded Norway in April 1940, the death penalty had not been executed since 1876. In the late 19th century, there was widespread opposition to it in Norway, with many advocates of its abolition describing it as a barbaric form of punishment that served no purpose in the prevention of crime. With the Norwegian Criminal Code of 1902, the death penalty was formally abolished from civilian law. It was, however, retained in military law for acts committed on the scene of war. But it was only during war that death penalty could be executed. Once the war had ended, the Norwegian law stipulated that any death penalty sentence would automatically be turned into a sentence of lifetime imprisonment. So what we see in the pre-war era is a sharp divide between times of war and times of peace. Norway proudly self-identified as a country with civilized and modern legal traditions and relied on the principles for reintegration and re-socialization of criminal convicts. The occupation of Norway complicated this picture. Tens of thousands of Norwegians collaborated with the German occupier, and some of these individuals engaged in political oppression, torture and murder in the name of National Socialism. The exile government, based in London, decided to announce that it would employ the death penalty against collaborators after a liberation. It hoped that announcing the intended use of the death penalty would send a strong warning signal to collaborators in territorial Norway. Moreover, in anticipating the situation upon liberation, it hoped that declaring that the worst collaborators would be punished by death and that the legal system would treat collaborators harshly would prevent lynch justice during a period of transition. You just remember they were physically so far removed from territorial Norway, there was no way of estimating what the situation would be, and there would inevitably be a period before they would be able to return. But as we've seen, the pre-war military provisions on the death penalty were insufficient because they could not be used after the end of the war. So what the London government did in a series of extraordinary provisional decrees in 1941-1942 was to reintroduce the death penalty into peacetime law. Given the wartime situation, the exile government deemed the reintroduction of the death penalty entirely unproblematic. It argued that the public demanded this, and in a commentary on one of the provisional decrees, the official argument was that, and I quote, "In light of the situation, there is no point in responding to these crimes with criminal penalties tailored to a civilized society." What the wartime decrees did, therefore, was to abolish the previously clear dividing line between war and peace and use of the death penalty. The exiled government deemed it necessary to extend wartime logic, at least for a limited period of time, into a post-liberation period. When Norway was liberated, officials repeated their promise that Norway would carry out a reckoning with collaborators and that collaborators would be treated harshly. It did so in the hope that it could prevent extralegal violence. And there was a hope also that the emotions of the liberation moment could be challenged into the legal system. And it has to be added that Norway was aware of the experience in France, for example, and had the hope of really sort of providing an institutional form to this moment of anger. The government therefore saw little need to justify the use of the death penalty from a legal point of view. It merely argued in public statements that the public demanded this and that the use of the death penalty was a demand of society. Now, there are no official opinion surveys from summer 1945. We can expect that people were busy doing other things than conducting the surveys. But what we do know is that summer 1945 was a period marked by strong social tensions in Norway. There was widespread anticipation that the death penalty would be used swiftly against collaborators, and many patriotic Norwegians called for an elimination of traitors from society. So there was widespread support, or at least we can see there's an absence of opposition to the death penalty. Rhetoric was quite one-sided, and there was no call for caution against using the death penalty. There appears to have been a consensus at the time that if the legal treatment of collaborators was harsh enough, then the public would refrain from engaging in extralegal violence. But this, in turn, of course, set extremely high expectations for the trials and the institutions that had to administer them. When we look at some of the public narratives of the summer of 1945, it becomes clear that there was almost a ritualistic element in employing the death penalty. The President of Norway's Parliament, who himself advocated the death penalty, argued that, and I quote, the death penalty would allow for a cleansing process which is necessary for the continued existence of society and its preservance. So really these traitors, these collaborators had to be removed, physically removed from society. A newspaper columnist defended the use of the death penalty by likening it to an elimination of rats. So in the press more generally, collaborators were seen as inferior. There were often sort of racial typifications. They were classified as having low intelligence, that they were morally corrupt. And rhetoric against them was so strong that there's no way really of seeing how there could have been a place for them in post-war society. They had simply forfeited their right to be Norwegians. Public protests held in Norway throughout the summer called for widespread use of the death penalty, and we see here a protest in August 1945 where patience was running out. So the trials were only just beginning. No executions had yet been carried out. And here we see 30,000 people in a central square in Oslo who later delivered a resolution to the government who called for widespread use of the death penalty against collaborators. And there were similar protests across the country. There was a threat that if the will of the people was not implemented by the courts, that people would take justice in their own hands, and this is one of the sentences that sort of ran through public discourse at the time. As we added that during the summer, there was little degree for nuance when it came to the offensive collaboration. In the collective mind, the dividing line simply ran between good and bad Norwegians. something which would later become more differentiated. It is perhaps not surprising, therefore, that given the strong social tensions, the strong expectations for the use of the death penalty, when Norway's parliament had to pass legislation concerning the death penalty, it voted in favour of it with an overwhelming majority. The courts also saw no reason to call into question the wartime provisions introducing the death penalty, and so a series of death penalty sentences were handed down in the autumn of 1945, most famously in the trial against Quisling, the leader of the Norwegian fascist party National Assembly, who was executed in October that year. But there soon came to be a problem in that the wartime estimates have been that these trials of collaborators would be concluded by the end of 1945. They would come, in fact, to last until 1953. And from 1946 onwards, the attitudes towards collaborators became more differentiated as the anger of the occupation gradually receded to the background. And moreover, the death penalty came to be seen as increasingly alien to peacetime legal principles. It became increasingly accepted by the public that the vast majority of collaborators would have to be reintegrated into society. And we can see a growing differentiation between the small-scale collaborators and the major collaborators. And just to put this into context, perhaps, around 93,000 individuals were investigated for treason in the context of these trials. Only 30 death penalty verdicts were handed down. So there's increasing acceptance that there were a lot of smaller cases of collaboration. But officials had to tread a fine line in assessing the public mood when it came to these different categories of collaborators. While smaller collaborators were gradually released into society, there were a number of high-profile cases pending for which there remained a strong public demand that the death penalty would be applied. By late 1946, the Minister of Justice admitted there was, and I quote, a strong and widespread opposition to the death penalty in this country, but he argued that the continued use was justified in certain cases of grave treason. And at the time, it also became increasingly difficult to assess the public mood. Public support for the trials, this grand project of the post-war authorities, was being called into question more widely, while a small faction of society advocated a much more extensive use of the death penalty, an increasing number of people called for leniency. As the distance and time to the occupation grew, the death penalty came to be met with increasing unease by politicians and the wider public. There was a concern that the death penalty would corrupt the moral standards of society and cast a negative light on Norway. Opposition in civil society began to become much more vocal from 1947 onwards, with pastors, interest groups and private citizens sending numerous requests to the government calling for an abolition of the death penalty. It seemed out of place with Norway's proud legal traditions and the way in which the post-war national community defined itself. A survey in September 1947 showed that 62% of citizens opposed further execution in the context of the trials. And as a consequence, the government from late 1947 onwards began pardoning select individuals who had been sentenced to death, a measure that had been unthinkable just a few years prior. And in its reasoning for granting the death penalty pardon in December 1947, the Ministry of Justice argued that we're now approaching the final stages of the reckoning, and the death penalty must not be introduced as a permanent element of our criminal justice system. Even though no changes have been made or will be made to the criminal nature of the offence of treason, one bears acknowledge that a change in attitudes has manifested in wide circles of our population with regard to the necessity of executing death penalty verdicts. In February 1948, a cross-party initiative of MPs called upon the government to abolish the death penalty altogether. The government consulted the Norwegian Director of Public Prosecutions on the matter, who argued that at the time he estimated there would be only a few cases left that would lead to a death penalty verdict. He argued that there were significant arguments against the continued use of the death penalty for, and I quote, "the death penalty is not a part of the Norwegian legal system. This has long since been expressed in the lawmaking of this country, which followed a natural development in abolishing it. This conviction is deeply rooted in the people's sense of justice. But both the direct public prosecutions and the Minister of Justice argued against abolishing the death penalty, and they used the argument of the inner consistency of the trials, meaning that cases brought to trial later on should not benefit from a change in the legal framework. And while the inner consistency was the official argument for retaining the death penalty, another reason was that the trials against certain high-profile collaborators, ministers in Quisling's cabinet, were still pending, and in the eyes of the post-war authorities, these people deserved or demanded the death penalty verdict. So there's a highly symbolic element to this as well. And Norway's parliament followed the government's recommendations and voted to retain the death penalty. But the vote was close, with 40% of MPs opposing it. The last individual to be executed in Norway was Anna Skanke, the National Assembly Minister for Church and Education Affairs. The execution took place on the 28th of August 1948. Now, while earlier executions, such as those of Viking Quisling or Ryder Halland and Nazi Churcher, had stirred only little protest, the execution of Skanke really shook the public. By 1948, sufficient time had passed for the unforgiving stance of the liberation movement to have receded into the background, and the nation increasingly sought to connect to its pre-war identity, its pre-war values and principles, and to leave the war behind. Ahead of Skanke's execution, hundreds of pastors, teachers, academics, and members of civil society had run a campaign to prevent the execution. And this was both a debate about Skanke as a person, who some deemed to have not committed crimes as grave as those of others who received the death penalty, but it was also, when we look at the arguments, a debate about the death penalty in principle. There's frequent talk about returning to a mentality of peace. And after Skanke's execution, the government really took note of this public response, and no more executions were carried out. Gradually, the government pardoned the remaining death penalty convicts. The strong public protest against further death penalty executions meant also that society was willing to see sentenced collaborators, even those sentenced for grave crimes, as citizens, and this is the term we see with increasing frequency from 40 onwards. And that these citizens could, in theory, take up a place in the post-war community. In practice, they would often, of course, be challenging socially, and they would still be stigmatized. But what these debates also show is that Norwegian society condemned the death penalty. In 1950, the death penalty was abolished from peacetime law, and the last prisoner originally sentenced to death was released from prison in 1957. Just a few concluding thoughts. In wartime and post-war discourses, the traitor, as in other occupied countries, was widely considered worse even than the German enemy. He forfeited his right to belong to the national community. The reintroduction of the death penalty, perhaps, despite Norway's pre-war traditions, was therefore perhaps no surprise. There was to be no place in post-war society for traitors. There was a faith in the legal system, and that the legal system would do justice. And in this context, in the post-liberation context, this meant that it had to absorb a general desire for violence and depart punctually from its pre-war principles. But in the long run, there was no place in post-war Norwegian society for the death penalty. As the nation recovered and stabilized after liberation, and confidence in its pre-war rules and values grew, it allowed for even some of the more high-profile collaborators to return to society. The violent and undifferentiated mood of liberation had given way for a more nuanced understanding of collaboration and a return to peacetime principles of law.
Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. Okay, the next speaker is Henrik Lundtoften. I hope the pronunciation is okay.
Perfect.
Don't believe you. Since 2004, he's the head of the historical archive of the German occupation located in Esker, which is now a section of the Museum of Southwest Jutland. He has published a couple of articles and books about German police, propaganda and opinion of Denmark, and about Gestapo, terror, war, society, and so on in Scandinavia. He also worked as a reviewer of books on World War II for the Danish newspaper Politiken. And
not anymore.
Not anymore? Okay. But you did that. And also as a part-time lecturer at the University of Aarhus in 2015 and 2016. And now you will talk about Danes against Danes.
Yes. We have to take our seats. Could we have the finding I'm a bit the odd man in this panel because I'm going to focus on political violence at the end of the war in German-occupied Denmark. But I was inspired by the agenda of this conference, that is the discussion on the relation between nationalism and violence. It can certainly help to deepen our understanding of developments during 1944 and 1945. In Denmark, that was a time when political violence changed this comparatively very peaceful country. During the last phase of the war, Danes were not only executed by the Germans, Danes were also killed by Danes in the streets. In February 1945, in average, a person was shot down every day in Copenhagen as a consequence of the conflict between, on the one hand, the German police and especially the Danish collaborators, and on the other hand, the resistance groups. So why this violent outburst? I'll try to answer by analyzing key elements in the radicalization as well as discussing the role of nationalist ideas. I argue that the driving force behind the radicalization wasn't only German policies, but also an internal Danish conflict. I'm focusing on the German Hilfspolizei in Denmark. The Hilfspolizei played an important role in the radicalization. Furthermore, the Hilfspolizei represented an extreme national socialist Danish subculture. I've written a book on them called Håndlangerne in Danish, that's translated henchmen, and a PhD on the Hilfspolizei and the Danes in this organization who collaborated with the German police from 1944 to 1945. In wartime streets and in collective memory, these police collaborators were hated and known as hippos. These are the themes I try to present and discuss. The photo, by the way, is authentic, showing a man from the Hippo attacking another man in the streets of Copenhagen around Christmas time, 1944. First of all, very briefly, some words on occupied Denmark. A Sonderfall in German-occupied Europe by the German soldiers known as the Schlagsteiner Front, a very peaceful and nice place to be a German soldier. The background was that on the day of the occupation on the 9th of April 1940, the Danish government stopped fighting the German troops, and in return, the Germans allowed the government to stay in office. This political deal of April 40 also meant that during the following 3 years, the Danish authorities and police, not the Germans, fought the tiny resistance. No Danes were executed in this period. There were no political murders and so on. Peace was the case in Denmark. In August 1943, however, the Germans reacted to a wave of sabotage and strikes and demanded the use of capital punishment by the Danish government to stop sabotage. The government denied and demissioned. The end of government-state collaboration in 1943 was a considerable victory for the resistance. On the other hand, now German authorities were empowered and German police and Gestapo began fighting resistance with executions, torture and deportations. Even though the methods adopted by the German police remained more lenient than in other occupied countries, a process of radicalization had begun. In late 1943, resistance groups committed the first murders of Danes believed to be Gestapo informers. Resistance leaders sanctioned this. However, as saboteurs bombed a cafe popular among Germans and killed 4 soldiers and Danish girls, the resistance leadership openly distanced itself and warned against such actions randomly directed against Germans. At the same time, Himmler and the military demanded more severe reprisals. Hitler himself decreed Gegenterror, counter-terror. This reactive reprisal concept meant that from late 1943, the Gestapo and German and Danish SS members murdered Danes to revenge killings of Germans and Danish collaborators and to send a warning signal to the resistance and the population. This development escalated in 1944 when Hitler, with the terror and sabotage Erlass, further promoted terroristic reprisals. And then in September 1944, an initiative by the Højere SS and Polizeiführer in Denmark, Günther Panke, to reorganize the Danish police force completely failed and ended with the deportation of 2,000 Danish policemen and the formation of a German-controlled auxiliary police force, the Hilfspolizei. Günther Panke's Hilfspolizei attracted around 700 Danes commanded by Danish National Socialists. The HIPO members worked closely with the Gestapo and arrested hundreds of Danes, especially in Copenhagen. Some prisoners were severely tortured before they were handed over to the Gestapo. Others were killed by the members of the Hilfspolizei. The presence and methods of the Hilfspolizei, the Nazi reprisal concept, and increasing resistance actions and liquidations of informers created an escalating violent cycle. The cycle can be demonstrated by some numbers. From 1943 until the German capitulation in May 1945, resistance groups in total liquidated approximately 400 Danes. Some of them were informers, and around 35 were members of the Hilfspolizei. From the other side, from autumn 1944 to May 1945, the Hilfspolizei killed approximately 100 to 150 persons, not all members of the resistance. To emphasize the radicalization, at the very end of the occupation, we can look at April 1945. Here the resistance killed 106 Danes and the HIPO around 50 people. Despite of these killings, Denmark still was a relatively peaceful place in Europe. However, not only for the occupation, but also for modern Danish history in general, the brutalization is obvious and very remarkable. The radicalization of the conflict between German police and the armed collaborators and the resistance movement was the result of resistance activism, the Hilfspolizei and the terror concept. That resulted in a brutalization that again opened up a kind of vendetta-like cycle of violence with certain patterns and rituals. Some of these patterns appear in connection with a succession of bloody incidents in February 1945 in Copenhagen. On the 27th of February 1945, 2 armed saboteurs suddenly noticed a police car with members from the Hilfspolizei. The saboteurs fired, and the HIPOs were trapped in their car and 3 of them were killed. This incident is said to be the background of this photo taken from April 1945 in Copenhagen of a Hilfspolizei car, where as you can see the doors have been taken off. This was in the memory of resistance, members of resistance, an example that they now were so scared that they were driving around Copenhagen without doors in their cars. If it's true or not, I don't know, but it still points to the brutalization in the streets. A A reporter wrote in his diary, and I quote, "The members of the HIPO have become the #1 enemy of the patriots. This observation and other sources imply that in the eyes of the resistance and most of the population, the Danes in the Hilfspolizei were not only a threat, they were traitors par excellence. They were rats and not fellow citizens anymore." And the resistance leadership now signaled that any resistance group could shoot the Danes in this cause. The Hilfspolizei men were outlaws. However, other sources also indicate that the resistance leadership in the winter of 1945 regarded the HIPO as a kind of training tool for the resistance groups before a much more serious situation could occur, if, for instance, the German regime collapsed and invasion began, or if a full-scale civil war broke out. Furthermore, a city like Copenhagen simply lacked sabotage objects in the last phase of the war, while the number of action-prepared resistance members were rising quickly. This also turned the Hilfspolizei into a target. The hunting were also the hunters. Finally, the resistance actions could be interpreted as a kind of premature purge before a German capitulation and before post-war courts could instigate legal proceedings against the collaborators. No matter what, this approach by the resistance gave the conflict between the illegal groups and the collaborators the strongest dimension of an internal Danish conflict, especially as the Danes in the Hilfspolizei themselves deepened and brutalized the conflict. On the night after the 3 men from the Hilfspolizei had been killed, the HIPO comrades, no doubt sanctioned by the German police, began a regular tour of retaliation. They bombed a couple of cafes and a statue of a liberal pacifist politician and murdered 7 men in retaliation in Copenhagen. This succession of bloody incidents show patterns typical for the violent escalation. For one thing, it all took place in Copenhagen, by far the largest Danish city and the place where the Hilfspolizei and the German police were concentrated. Political violence was a city phenomenon. Furthermore, the incident happened on Nørrebro, a densely populated working-class district in Copenhagen, a communist stronghold, and one of the riot centers in the Copenhagen general strike in the summer of 1944. Moreover, it was one of the city districts where the Danes in the Hilfspolizei for once had behaved as they were on hostile soil. And foreign soil. There's no time for a thick description or a microhistory inspired really close look at cases like this one, but the source material makes this approach possible. The material shows that another important factor was pure vengeance. One of the dead HIPO men had a twin brother in the Hilfspolizei. The extent of reprisals in this case are signs that both the subculture, the HIPO brotherhood so to speak, and the surviving brother wanted violent revenge. The ritual part also was obvious. The perpetrators from the Hilfspolizei brought some of the victims from the resistance to the district of Nørrebro, where they murdered them and left them in the street. The idea, of course, was to send a clear political signal to the resistance and population. This was also typical for the pattern in the SS counter-terror actions in Denmark. From this case, it is also clear that the line between subculture vendetta and German occupation policies of terror gradually erased. And we can even learn more from this case. Of the 7 murdered members of the resistance, 4 were known communists. This brings us to the question of the political and ideological background to violence. The point is that the Hilfspolizei presumed that the perpetrators from the resistance were communists. The idea that the resistance one way or the other was communist and that the members therefore were representatives of the Soviet Union was widespread among leading members of the Hilfspolizei and the national subculture among them. They were Danish national socialists. Nationalism in this subculture also implied racism, anti-Semitism, as well as anti-Americanism. However, in 1944 and 45, the most important nationalist element was the strong anti-communism among the members. And Anti-communism and nationalism are important keys to understand violence and murders, and to explain how a small extremist network of armed collaborators reacted to political and social ostracization and how they responded to attacks from the resistance. Danish Nazi periodicals, propaganda and diaries represent this ultra-nationalist culture. A couple of examples. The magazine Forgot Dansk, meaning something like in plain Danish, a periodical that was distributed in the Nazi subculture. The front page says, "Liberated Europe." And typical for these periodicals, it depicted a liberated Europe with hunger, political chaos, and communist coup approaching. The poster depicting a cattle wagon guarded by death going to Siberia says "Aldrig," meaning never. That doesn't need explanation. Actually, it's a German propaganda poster from May 1945, but it illustrates precisely sentiments among leading men in the Hilfspolizei. They thought the communist threat was imminent, and the perspective of defeat was Sovietization and deportations to Siberia. In their own perspective, the men in the Hilfspolizei represented patriotism, defended Denmark, the nation, and the families against Bolshevik horrors. This also is clear from the few existing contemporary diaries and letters written by men who joined the Hilfspolizei. They emphasized that anti-communist and nationalist thinking was a part of the way they in their daily life interpreted the world. How long have I got left?
4.5 minutes.
All this seems to show us that nationalism was important both for the way the HIPO members interpreted the war and the resistance, as well as for their self-perception. In their worldview, they had to save the nation against two unpatriotic enemies, against communists who wanted to incorporate Denmark in the Soviet Union, and against conservative and bourgeois elites who were unable to identify the imminent threat from the communists, if not sympathizing with them. Partly it was a question of purging the country for communists. For the members in the Hilfspolizei, it was a struggle for national survival. This self-perception of being patriots, rescuers of the nation, not only legitimized collaboration with an occupation power. When in their view, the men in the HIPO had the historic and faithful mission of nothing less than saving the nation, civilization and families, then this also legitimized violence. Murdering and torturing enemies would be seen as a necessity as part of the higher patriotic cause. At the same time, resistance members were reduced to representatives of foreign un-Danish interests. So there's a link between the violence and the radicalization, and then the ideas in this subculture and what happens in the streets. A few words on the post-war period then. The confrontations between the resistance and the Hilfspolizei continued even beyond the 5th of May 1945, when the German troops in Denmark capitulated. The HIPO became a long-lasting national symbol of treason and violence. In popular culture, the HIPO men first were perceived as a serious threat to post-war society. Then they were ostracized and ridiculed as mentally ill, like the case was in Norway. An illustrative song described them as decay, as rotten trees, or just like rats in other popular cases. This kind of banishment from the collective national identity seems to be quite typical for many liberated countries. The stigmatization is obvious from this photo from 1945, showing an arrested man from the Hilfspolizei with a sign saying, I am an informant. The members of the former Hilfspolizei were interned and often given a very rough treatment. A couple of cases, resistance groups some days after the liberation killed people who they believed had been informers for the Hilfspolizei. After the capitulation, approximately 40,000 Danes were arrested and interned by resistance groups and police. Due to a political compromise between politicians and resistance leaders, retrospective legislation was introduced and the death penalty was reinstated. This was Danish transitional justice. Most probably the war experience of political and economic collaboration 1940 to 1943 made the purge of national and violent outcasts like the Hilfspolizei men even harder. And these Danes in the HIPO constituted the group given the most severe punishment in the Danish post-war trials. With no regards to involvement in raids and arrest, the punishment for being just a member of the Hilfspolizei was 10 years in prison. Involvement in torture and killings resulted in a number of death penalties. 46 Danes were executed, 13 of these 46 had been working for the Hilfspolizei. The last one was executed in 1950. At that time, most of the convicts had been released on parole. My idea was to give a brief perspective on relations in Norway, but I don't think the chair will accept it. I haven't got the time. 1 minute. 1 minute, so I'll just finalize by saying that this internal Danish conflict between, on the one hand, the Hilfspolizei and other collaborationist groups, and on the other hand, the resistance, escalated into a conflict that contained radicalizing patterns and rituals and looked like the beginning of civil war. A Danish variant of this Endphasegewalt, which German research have pointed to. The Nazi reprisal concept, the counter-terror, created a violent cycle, and so did resistance activism. And finally, the ultra-nationalist Danes in the Hilfspolizei interpreted the resistance as a terrible communist threat. In the worldview of the men in the HIPO, they were the true patriot defenders of the nation. And this, in the Danish Sonderfall context, could demand brutal reprisals and justify murder and violence. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for that perfect time management and time discipline. Now we have about half an hour, or perhaps a little bit more than half an hour for discussion. And I'm sure there will be plenty of comments and questions. Floor is open.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for fascinating presentations. And I have a question to all presenters, but first of all, I want to ask Henrik and Annika about death penalty to women, to female collaborators. Do you notice these gender dimensions in this post-war justice, and how many women were executed, for example, and how many women were punished because they were in Hilfspolizei, for example, like secretaries or translators, because in Ukraine we also have such cases. And in this regard, it's very interesting for me what the role of accusations of sexual collaboration in this regard, because it was very often additional accusation against female collaborators in Ukraine. And also I have a question to first presenters, also regarding sexual collaboration and punishment for sexual collaboration. So the first question, also about how many women in Italy were punished by because of horizontal, let's say, collaboration with enemies of the nation, and what about children? What we know about children of those punished women? Thank you very much.
Perhaps we collect questions. So.
Yeah.
Two questions for Mrs. Deluna and Federer, and also two for Mrs. Senna. Senna, what has been the death toll of the operation in Norway? because you must take into account when we discuss about the discussion about the perspective. And also, the rat stereotype, so used. What was his use in pre-war days? Have you an idea? In public discussion, the rat, those are rats.
Yeah.
Is there such a discourse before the war? And what kind of discourse? Was there any discussion, possible discussion about, much more urges, about the role of the local judiciary during World War II and in the case of Italy during the fascist years? I mean, the judges who are passing those penalties for both cases, who were there? Was there any kind of accusation for the judiciary? People who were part of the court martials, or it was the fascist repression. And second, what was the outcome of those responsible trials against partisans? I mean, there were people, what were the penalties? Were people condemned or not?
Yes, thank you for the interesting papers, all of them. And I couldn't help thinking about a conference I went to, it must have been 25 years ago, at the Institute for Wissenschaft und Menschen in Vienna, about collaboration and resistance during World War II, in which the fundamental theme was, and this was run by Tony Judd and Istvan Deák and Jan Gross, and the fundamental theme was how quickly these societies could forget collaboration, and how quickly they could turn their back on what they themselves had done. And in all of these papers, in some ways, and the Danish one at the end, you have a feeling of what's going on is not just building a new nation, shaping a new polity, creating new laws, and getting back to normal, but forgetting what the majority of people frequently had been involved in: fascism in Italy, collaboration in France, and going along with the German occupation in Denmark. So none of you talk about this kind of issue of memory and forgetting, and trying to just get past individual responsibility, blame it on other people. Let's get out of here, right, into something else. So the end of the period interests me in all of your cases.
Okay, introduction.
I'm happy to start. I'll start with the question on women. Two death penalty verdicts, I believe, were handed down against women, but they were both pardoned. And there is research suggesting there was a gender element that they were pardoned, not just because of the case as such, but because of there being a reluctance in executing women. I will leave the question about horizontal collaboration till tomorrow. I think there's a presentation tomorrow on that particular question, which has its own complexities. But within the context of the legal framework, I believe around a third of those investigated for collaboration were women. And this, in the Norwegian context, the particular reason that the German occupier and National Samling jointly tried to sort of build a system corresponding to the German system, where there were many women's organizations, women's fascist organizations, and those women involved in the leadership of these organizations, for example, were investigated and often punished for collaboration. So there's definitely a gender dimension here that's worth exploring. And also one, even when women weren't the primary suspects, there's also the element, of course, that the women suffered by the spouse, often breadwinner, being put on trial. So the trials or the sentence for treason often affected an entire family. This had particular ramifications in the context that all points that I haven't addressed today is that a verdict automatically also meant that individuals lost their civil and political rights and also access to a lot of professions. So there was a lot of financial margin as well. So women come in this context as well. But I would say overall there was more of a reluctance to punish women as harshly, and that the main traitor was seen as male effectives in the ministerial structures and so forth. Regarding the question of the death, or shall we go by topic perhaps? Or?
I could just add to your question that the picture in post-war Denmark is much the same as in Norway. There were 2 or 3 women being sentenced to death, but there was a broad consensus that in Denmark we do not execute women. So there's certainly a gender aspect of this post-war purge. On the other hand, women were driven through the streets and their hair shaved off, like we heard in the beginning about France and Italy. Also in Denmark, very gruesome, even in small cities. But they were not sentenced for horizontal collaboration. But interestingly, for the revenge element of the purges, in the summer of 1945, I think it was around 75% of the Danish population in Apport who thought that women who had a sexual relationship to Germans should be executed. But that was a kind of post-war madness that quickly faded out again, so to speak. So they were not punished for it at the course, but for years afterwards. Of course, some of them were ostracized of their local community. Yeah.
Okay, first the question about horizontal collaboration. I just want to say that in Italy it's not a real imputation, but it's something that makes more severe the penalty for women. And in France there is a new, it's create a new imputation of new penalties, limite nazionale della degradation nazionale, that punish all the behavior that is not the real treason by law, but a behavior that can help the occupiers and territory. And about the children, I don't know very much, but I know that the children that women had with the occupiers or with the Germans, there was very discriminated in the post-war period, and a lot of them try to forgive this origin of the resentment. And about forgiveness, in Italy it came from institution very soon. There is in 1946 the amnesty, Progetti amnesty. It's a very large amnesty against for collaborators, in favor of the collaborators, that help to stop the process of separation in Italy, and it's for the reconciliation of the Italians. There are many debates and discussions about this amnesty. It seems too lenient in favor of the powers.
Concerning the question about evaluation and who were the judges, actually it's a really central question, because both in France and in Italy, Protestant association, Communist Party, etc., complain for a not satisfying evaluation of judges of magistrature in general. Sometimes the judges who judge the partisans were the same that judges them during the fascist regime or the Vichy regime. But we have also to take into consideration that to make the free state, the new state, work again, judges were needed. So if a large and entire evaluation were done, there were not judges to make the extraordinary court work. So there is these two sides that we have to take into consideration, but actually, yes, the question of the coercion is really central, and we can see in the propaganda about the trials of partisans that some judges are really the same that the past periods. And concerning the penalties for partisans, there is a difference that is really important to highlight between France and Italy, because in Italy partisans were judged only by criminal courts. Instead, in France, there is also military courts that judge the partisans, because partisans are equal to soldiers for the French jurisdiction. So in France, also military courts prosecuted partisans. And so in France, partisans were also condemned to death. We have 3 death sentences, but that is not executed. Concerning the number, it is really hard to find a realistic number, because partisans, they are not extraordinary courts as for collaborators. So there is not in the archives, they are not pointed out as collaborators, but they are people generally as people. So for Italy, we have some more data, and for example, that is really according to regional zone. And for example, for the city of Bologna, the amount of years of jail was more than 600 years of jail. And for example, for France, we have 965 years of detention that have been pronounced for partisans, and but there are data that are not really. Yes, it's really difficult to find real data on this.
Okay. Would you like to proceed? Okay, then I have 2 questions.
We had a comment about
Sorry.
I could begin with, okay. Well, in the Danish context, the point is absolutely true that virtually on the 5th of May, the Liberation Day, 1945, the reconstruction of what was the right memory about the 5 occupation years began. And in Denmark, in that case, it was quickly a kind of compromise between the resistance and the politicians. That the politicians, especially were interested in something like the French youth of the sword and the shield, saying that they were in fact not the active resistance, but they were the passive resistance, and this could also contain most of the population. Everyone agrees that all from the 9th of April 1940 have been against occupation, against National Socialism and so on, except for the rotten ones. And the interesting thing is that I myself said that they were ostracized. In a sense, the collaborators wasn't, because they were a necessary part of post-war society as a kind of counter part to patriotism. And by pointing to, by directing the post-war anger at someone like the former members of the Hitler side, well, that made a kind of black and white perception of what had happened. All the in between difficult problems of 3 years of government collaboration and in my hometown, for instance, Esbjerg had been badly hit by the 30s crisis and the Depression, but the occupation time was a golden era for the economy in some Danish cities and in many ways in the country as a whole. And there were no interests in 1945 or 6 or something like that up to talk about that. It was much better to concentrate on the traitors. That was the Danish perspective.
Yeah, at the Norwegian perspective, I mean, I think there's probably a similar trend in terms of this factor of time passing, changing perspectives. But I think what makes the Norwegian case different is the sheer scope of the trials and the legal provisions that they had, the ex-government had put in place, meant that an enormous amount in proportion to the population as a whole had to be investigated, 3.2% of the Norwegian population. And that did mean that in between 45 and 48 times, there was an enormous sort of self-reflective debate about who are we and are these trials just? And I think this differs from the case dinner. It covered newspapers every single day, and it was such a heated debate that the government became concerned. This is going to drive our nation apart at a time, and I think here the year 1948 becomes important with the threat of war looming. The government took measures to actually appease this public debate and say we need to unite the nation, and that's when we have the first larger sort of amnesty provisions. And I do think that the 3 years between 45 and 48 are a period in which there's sort of this tormenting element of it, but at the same time, I think this holds true probably for all occupied countries, that there is the tendency for people who had a bit of an ambivalent position, of course, to side with the patriotic community, and so we see people, especially economic collaborators, it's widespread in Norway, to say, well, we were the real bad ones. But I do think it took a larger space in public discourse in Norway than it did in Denmark. But I think from 48 onwards, we see just new threats and new challenges arising, which perhaps made it necessary sort of to leave that task. In the Norwegian context, we do see these trials as sort of still standing out in public memory, something that was too harsh, or something that people sort of feel bad about. But there's a period of silence, and now it's being worked through again.
Just to add,
yeah.
that I completely agree, and the interesting facet is that there was also a change in the harshness of the purge in Denmark exactly at the same time as in Norway. But to my knowledge, there wasn't at all a public debate on the same level as in Norway.
Okay, then I have two brief questions. The first one is, the title of the conference is Reshaping the Nation. And if we look at all those cases, the question is, are those 4 collaborators or so still part of the nation or not? I mean, in the case of death penalty, the thing is clear, excluded. But for example, if we look at that woman, or at that guy here, is he still seen as a part of the nation, or does he have a chance to become a part of the nation again, or not? The second question is, and it follows, and pictures are highly problematic source, because it shows a kind of ambiguity. From our today's perspective, is it a victim or is it a perpetrator? I mean, those who made that photo, at the time, for them it was clear, perpetrator. But this is dehumaniting, in a way. It's a dehumaniting procedure. And then we see the perpetrator or victim, we do not see who did that. Just a nameless crowd. Do you have any hints whether women also participated in those dehumanizing procedures, I mean, shaving hairs or so, or was it a male affair? And then the gender again appears again, sorry. Some more questions? Strange, okay.
Can I make a question?
Please, of course.
Okay. I was wondering if...
Oh, sorry.
It's just for the Italians one more. If there is any difference between Northern Italy and Southern Italy, which had a very different political life. In Northern Italy, we had this civil war between resistance and the south state. In the south, it was more blurred, the continuity between before 43 and after.
Absolutely, yes. There is a great difference between North and South of Italy. If we consider also the trials of partisans, there are in Northern Italy, and I don't know if you want, Barbara, if you want to say something on the collaborators, but the most of these trials is on the Northern Italy, yeah.
In the south, there were no trials of the collaborators. What kind of collaborators?
Yeah, because civil wars was very hard in North Italy, but the South Americans came after. So it was less hard, and the trials were very few.
Were there any trials about the fascist past, yes, the national past, political trials of what the fascist regime had done?
Yeah.
There were any kind of trials, not trials of treason, but trials of, were there? Or?
Yeah, there was the High Court, the High Court of Justice in France and Italy also.
Okay. Yes. So, in fact, actually, in Italy, the trials of fascists were later, starting really later in the 90s. So for the massacre, for this the Italian were judged really later. Yeah, there is this big difference.
And the big chief were murdered in the days of liberation. Almost. Like Mussolini.
No. No women. Still part of the nation or not?
Okay.
Yeah, I think that for women, in the case of women, yes, because they have population, and they try to keep the women in the traditional roles. They don't try to expel them from society, but they try to re-educate them and reporting the women to the roles of wives and mothers and strictly domestic dimension of the society. For the men, it's different because probably the trials are something that put a line between who can be in society and who can't.
Okay, agency, who did that? A nameless crowd, or?
Yes, there were a lot of women in the celebration against collaborators, also when the women were shaved. In the picture we see a lot of women participate in this sort of celebration.
I can add that I think in Denmark the case was that it was mostly young men who were doing the shavings of the girl who had a relationship with German soldiers. That's very clear from other photos that was the case, and it already began during the war. in 1943, in the context of the strikes and the conflicts there. Some young men began shaving girls, sometimes very systematically. And then the interesting point about the pictures and the photos. This photo is a fine example of a double idea, because it's not only stigmatizing this person who had worked for the Germans, it's also a heroic portrait of some of the resistance fighters. And therefore it's a fine example of what we were talking about, that this is from the around 5th or 6th of May 1945, and this is pointing to the future. This is how the construction of the memory about occupied Denmark was until the discussion on collaboration and so on began in the 1970s.
Perhaps on excluding collaborators in general, from the gender perspective, I found quite fascinating in the Norwegian context. We have in the late 40s and early 50s a number of symbolic acts of reintegrating semi-collaborative society. So the dates that were chosen for either amnesties or for individuals to regain their citizenship rights or their civil rights were the 5 and 10 year date after the liberation. And this was very consciously chosen as a sort of reaching out and saying you can become part of society again. But this was, of course, just a sort of legislative and government position. And what surveys do show is, if we look at the sort of the social dimension, that, and this goes back to one of the earlier questions, that families and children remain stigmatized. And we almost have this dynamic of, because this was, of course, also in a small nation like Norway, sentencing collaborators also meant taking people out of the labour market. And so we have official schemes actually quite early on trying to facilitate labour market reintegration. But then, of course, in practice, there were such issues that people didn't want to do business with the collaborators and so forth.
So, okay, let's have a break. We meet again at
we have maybe 3 minutes.
So can I
Is there
start?
any question?
Can I start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's still agree 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay. So one remark and one little question for you. The remark concerning the question forget, memory issues, and so on. I think that one interesting thing to notice is that concerning France, most of all, the pursuit against partisans start in 47, 48, restart in 47, 48, after collaborators or the family of collaborators denounced partisans for having killed husband, son, etc., or for having stolen something in the house during the war. So there is also this change in the attitude of the society. So the collaborators now feel themselves as victims. So they denounce this kind of acts committed during the liberation war and the resistance period. So there is only just one thing I want to add. And a little question for you is, I'm wondering if you know if some trials against partisans for acts committed during the war being done in Denmark after the liberation.
Only very seldom, only in a couple of cases where they have been involved in theft or something like that. And actually, it's a question with relevance for this time, because just 2 weeks ago, a former member of the resistance died, and he had participated in the killing of a couple on the 7th or 8th of May 1945. The woman was even pregnant, and himself and his resistance friends thought that they had a great amount of distrust to the legal procedures and proceedings. So they did it themselves, so to speak, because they thought they had the right to do it. And just last year, they were beginning a case at the attorney's office against this 90-year-old man, and his death was probably something of a relief for the authorities that they didn't have to go through such a complicated case. So it was a question, an answer to a question.
Okay. How now?
Yeah. So, coffee break this way.